This is Lynn Domina at Let's Talk Books at NMU. We had a little bit of a technical glitch there, so we're sorry we're getting started a minute late. But I am Lynn Domina. I am coming to you from Northern Michigan University in Marquette, Michigan, where I am a professor of English. NMU is located on the sacred homelands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy. Today, I'm welcoming Miriam C. Brown Spiers, author of Encountering the Sovereign Other Indigenous Science Fiction, published by Michigan State University Press in 2021. This series will continue through the academic year on the third Friday of each month at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. In April, my guest will be Tom Taylor, presenting on his book, Modern Travel in World History, and that will be the last one for this year since we conclude our academic year soon after that. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen the icons for the chat and for the Q&A. Feel free to use the chat to talk with each other. If you want to post a question for our speaker, use the Q&A. I'll be monitoring that for our question period. If you see a question that interests you, you can give it a thumbs up icon, and that'll let me know it's a popular question. This episode is being recorded and will be posted soon on YouTube. You can also find previous episodes there on YouTube if you just search for Let's Talk Books at NMU. Before we get started, I want to give a big thanks to our staff over in Audiovisual Services here at NMU, who help us with the technical end, and also to Dean Rob Wynn, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, who is supporting us financially. Now I'd like to introduce Miriam C. Brown Spiers. She is an associate professor of English and American Studies at Kennesaw State University in Georgia, where she teaches a variety of courses in Native American literature, American culture, and gender studies. Her critical work has been published in Studies in American Indian Literature, Transmotion, and other academic journals. So, Miriam, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to stop my own screen share, and then you should be able to screen share yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me just get us started with screen sharing. All right. Okay. So I want to begin by thanking Dr. Domina and Northern Michigan University for inviting me to speak today. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for spending part of your Friday afternoon with us. I also want to apologize up front if I'm coughing a little and drinking a lot of tea. It is allergy season in Georgia right now. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Kennesaw State University, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Cherokee Nation. So this afternoon, as Dr. Domina said, I'm going to talk with you all about my book, Encountering the Sovereign Other, Indigenous Science Fiction. I originally came to this topic because I wanted to explore the intersections of two distinct interests. As a scholar, I'm deeply invested in Native American literature and the ways that Native authors transform the Euro-American genre of the novel to tell particularly Indigenous stories and reflect Native worldviews. But outside of my academic work, I also grew up loving science fiction because of the ways that it challenges me to see the world from different and unexpected perspectives. As I tell my students, science fiction is the literature of possibility and change, which makes it an ideal place to engage with and respond to histories of oppression and colonization. I began writing this book because I wanted to find out what happens when Indigenous authors appropriate science fictional genre conventions. Given that SF, which is short for science fiction, has a long history of retelling and reinforcing the tropes of colonialism, I wanted to explore the ways that Indigenous authors embrace the genre, resisting those problematic tropes and revealing the transformative potential of science fiction as a genre. So in my talk today, I'm going to introduce some of the key theoretical concepts from the book, and I'm going to illustrate those concepts by focusing on one specific text. That's Cherokee author William Sanders' 1999 novel, The Ballad of Billy Badass and the Rose of Turkestan. In the book, I also look at works of Indigenous science fiction by Blackfeet author Stephen Graham Jones, Choctaw writer D.L. Birchfield, and Cherokee novelist Blake Hausman. And I'd be happy to talk more about those books or other works of Indigenous science fiction during the Q&A at the end. So, Indigenous science fiction, that is, science fiction written by Indigenous authors as opposed to texts that simply include Native characters, is a relatively new genre, and the question of how we might define it is still under discussion. The development of that definition is complicated by the conflicting theoretical approaches of Native American studies and science fiction theory, as highlighted by the questions raised in the very act of naming the genre. Even the choice to refer to a collection of texts as Indigenous science fiction has implications. First, the word Indigenous shifts the emphasis from the tribally specific to broader literary categories. And second, the generic definition of science fiction emphasizes European and American rather than Native literary traditions. Given that Native literary critics, particularly those who heed the call of American Indian literary nationalism, have fought to establish a critical approach that recognizes Indigenous literatures as both tribally specific and separate from the Western canon, this problem of naming is a serious one. In recent years, Native American studies scholars have proposed various names for the genre, from Grace Dillon's Indigenous Futurism to Dean Rader's The Indian Invention novel, but each term encounters its own definitional difficulties. And due to time constraints, I'm not going to get into those difficulties here, but I'd be happy to say more at the end. While critics generally agree that Indigenous science fiction has the capacity to introduce new, Native-specific categories of storytelling, I argue that it also has the ability to challenge and expand the mainstream critical definitions of the genre itself. An analysis of Native science fiction should, of course, be grounded in both the tribally specific readings of American Indian literary nationalism and the broader theoretical perspective of Indigenous knowledge. But Indigenous science fiction is not simply traditional Native storytelling under a new name. It also consciously interacts with the tropes of mainstream science fiction. Additionally, then, Native SF can be usefully interpreted through the lens of Euro-American science fiction theory. Because the genre exists at the intersection of two disparate critical approaches grounded in two separate worldviews, an analysis of Indigenous science fiction from only one perspective will always be incomplete. Moreover, where Indigenous knowledge intervenes in science fiction theory, it questions basic Euro-American cultural assumptions and expands the boundaries of the genre as a whole. One of the texts that most clearly embodies this dialogue between disciplines is Cherokee author William Sanders' 1999 novel, The Ballad of Billy Badass and the Rose of Turkestan. In this book, Sanders revives and adapts the science fictional trope of the radiation monster in order to resist philosophies of nationalism and isolationism, instead encouraging his readers, both Native and non, to embrace an Indigenous ethical approach that is grounded in recognizing and respecting difference, even as we form alliances across political, ethnic, and religious borders. At first glance, the trope of radiation exposure may seem outdated and out of place in a contemporary novel, since the fear of radiation and its harmful side effects is often associated with mid-20th century American political fears that have largely subsided since the end of the Cold War. In Indigenous science fiction, however, that trope is complicated by the fact that radiation has been and continues to be the source of much legitimate fear in Native communities. In addition to the nuclear testing that took place near reservations in New Mexico, Utah, and Nevada during and after World War II, many uranium mines are located on or near Indigenous lands in the Southwest. As Sarah Elizabeth Fox explains, many American Indians worked in these mines without being informed of the risks of exposure, and therefore without proper protection. Many more Indigenous communities have since been affected by the legal and illegal disposal of nuclear waste on or near their reservations, and the medical and environmental issues caused by such exposure are a source of ongoing concern. Excuse me. As Fox eloquently sums up the situation, long after the dust has settled and the politicians have claimed victory and the historians have penned their summaries, cancers and illnesses will continue to manifest in the bodies of ordinary people, erasing the supposed boundaries between soldiers and civilians and making us all survivors and potential victims of a war we thought had ended. In addition to issues related to nuclear testing, the harnessing and wielding of nuclear power that has taken place in both the past and the present continues to affect Indigenous communities locally, while also threatening large-scale disasters that could cause significant harm at national and international levels. Uranium deposits may have originated on or near Indigenous lands, but as Fox persuasively argues, ultimately, we all live downwind of a nuclear test. These tests, alongside uranium mining and the careless disposal of nuclear waste, have led to the poisoning of natural resources such as air and water, as well as to the contamination of meat, dairy, and produce grown near test sites. Human exposure to radiation further leads to genetic mutations that can accumulate in both intensity and complexity as they are passed down. Given that environmental as well as human effects have inevitably spread beyond the boundaries of reservations, we must acknowledge that political and even temporal borders will ultimately fail to contain the long-term effects of radiation exposure. In fact, Fox reports that some Navajos, well aware of the damage that has been done in their communities, have begun to refer to uranium as the yellow monster. Considered in this context, it becomes clear that, by writing about a radiation monster that threatens to destroy the world, William Sanders has appropriated a recurrent rather than outdated genre convention in order to draw attention to an issue whose relevance for both Native and non-Native communities persists well into the 21st century. In the Ballad of Billy Badass, Sanders tells the story of Billy Badwater, aka Billy Badass, a Cherokee veteran of the First Gulf War who follows his girlfriend from Oklahoma to a Paiute reservation in Nevada. There, he and his friends encounter a radiation monster from another dimension that threatens to consume the entire world. By pitting humans against literal and metaphorical monsters, Sanders suggests that people must form alliances across cultural, national, and religious boundaries in order to survive. However, the novel warns that these alliances must not devolve into the oversimplified melting pot cast of characters that often appear in mainstream works of science fiction. In such stories, individual characters often stand in for entire nations or cultures, and ultimately, most of them exist to support the Euro-American protagonist who eventually saves the day. One of the most popular examples of this trope can be found in several incarnations of Star Trek, where, as Carter Malan has argued, a multicultural crew rallies behind a Euro-American captain whose decisions ultimately reinforce mainstream liberal American values. In Billy Badass, on the other hand, the Euro-American community remains helpless as the Indigenous characters quite literally save the world, drawing upon tribally specific knowledge and Indigenous ethics to do so. In order to understand why these characters are better able to handle the situation than their non-Native counterparts, it is useful to take a step back, examining the dialogue between science fiction theory and Native American studies that is at work in Indigenous SF. We can begin here by turning to the seminal science fiction theorist Darko Suvin, whose work is still considered the core critical approach specific to the genre against which almost everything else has been obliged to define itself. Suvin proposes that the defining characteristic of science fiction is the presence of a novum or strange newness, which is produced through the interaction of estrangement and cognition. This main formal device must be a kind of estrangement in that it represents an imaginative framework alternative to the author's empirical environment. That unfamiliar concept must also be explained through a cognitive process, what Suvin describes as either scientifically methodical cognition or intrinsic culturally acquired cognitive logic, rather than being conjured by magic or miracle. And I'm quoting directly from Suvin a lot here because his very specific word choice matters when you start to try to put him into conversation with Indigenous theorists. So more coming. In the case of Billy Badass, the presence of the radiation monster clearly serves as a strange newness that is outside of Sanders' empirical reality. But just as importantly, the novel offers a cognitive explanation for the monster's presence. It is accidentally summoned by Magda Simone, an ex-stripper who has turned a whorehouse in the desert outside of Las Vegas into a place she calls the New Age Enlightenment Center and Guest Ranch. Here, she plays the role of high priestess, and as Sanders describes it, she serves up a goulash of Indian mumbo jumbo, both kinds of Indian, of course, and fake Egyptology and Confucius-say Oriental philosophy, spiked with old-fashioned gypsy fortune-telling and topped with a thick layer of little men from outer space, like in the Spielberg movies. Somewhere along the way, Magda and her customers, quote, stumble blindly onto something bigger than all their fantasies when they accidentally open up a portal between dimensions through which the radiation monster falls. The novel is clearly critical of the way that Magda and her New Age followers appropriate religious beliefs from a variety of cultures, and they are punished for their behavior when, upon its arrival on this plane of existence, the creature literally rips their heads off. Beyond Sanders' tongue-in-cheek critique of cultural appropriation, it is important to distinguish between the novum, in this novel that's the radiation monster itself, and the novel's quiet validation of actual religious ceremonies. Rather than paint these ceremonies as whimsical examples of science fiction or fantasy, the novel suggests that they must be taken seriously. Thus, Sanders frames Indigenous religions as part of the cognitive or logical and scientific explanation behind the more unlikely elements of the story. At first, this complementary relationship between science and religion might seem antithetical to mainstream understandings of science fiction, and particularly to Suvin's definition of the genre, given his insistence that cognition differentiates science fiction not only from myth, but also from the folk or fairy tale and the fantasy. He argues that because myth uses a timeless and religious approach, it is diametrically opposed to the cognitive approach. For Suvin, then, religion and science are permanently at odds with one another, locked in a binary opposition that cannot be bridged. And yet, his own definition of cognitive estrangement takes a theoretical approach that demonstrates awareness of his own epistemological position while also acknowledging the validity of other worldviews. So going back to these definitions, we see that rather than using cognition as simply a stand-in for Western science in the way that we tend to mean it in Euro-American culture, Suvin is careful to define it as an intrinsic, culturally acquired cognitive logic. This broad definition makes space for other understandings of science and cognition, such as the tribally specific indigenous epistemologies that determine the underlying logic in many works of native science fiction. According to Tewa writer Gregory Kaihete, when speaking about indigenous or native science, one is really talking about the entire edifice of indigenous knowledge. This edifice can be said to be inclusive of modern science, just as Suvin suggests that cognition is wider than science. Where Suvin argues for the importance of the cultural or historical sciences, including sociological, psychological, historical, and anthropological parallels in understanding traditional works of science fiction, Kaihete observes that in native languages, there is no word for science, nor for philosophy, psychology, or any other foundational way of coming to know and understand the nature of life and our relationships therein. Not having or more accurately, not needing words for science, art, or psychology did not diminish their importance in Native life. For Native people, seeking life was the all-encompassing task. Both Suvin and Kaihete make the argument that science cannot be so easily broken down into distinct binary categories, noting instead that various disciplinary approaches all work toward the same objective. Despite the benefits of his culturally relativist terminology, however, Suvin's theory also clashes with many of the underlying principles of Native cultures, and thus with many of the themes that appear in Indigenous SF. The source of the problem lies in Suvin's argument, mentioned above, that myth and fantasy are, quote, religious and therefore antithetical to science. He criticizes myth for its timeless and religious approach that is diametrically opposed to the cognitive approach, since it conceives human relations as fixed and supernaturally determined. This pairing of the terms timeless and religious is key because it hints at Suvin's own culturally specific understanding of religion as that which is fixed. Given that the theoretical foundations of science fiction are rooted in a belief that humans are capable of change and adaptation, Suvin extends this understanding to suggest that religion is the polar opposite of SF. I would argue, however, that Suvin's definitions are grounded in a Euro-American perspective that simply fails to consider alternate interpretations. In order to understand why Suvin sees religion as fixed and static, as well as how we might redefine the term, it is useful to place his work in conversation with Standing Rock Sioux theorist and religious studies scholar Vine Deloria Jr. In God is Red, Deloria outlines the distinctions between Western European and Indigenous religions that Suvin's critique overlooks. He explains that the very essence of Western European identity involves the assumption that time proceeds in a linear fashion, an assumption that stems from religious beliefs. Deloria notes that from the very beginning of the religion, it has been the Christian contention that the experiences of humankind could be recorded in a linear fashion. And when this was done, the whole purpose of the creation event became clear, explaining not only the history of human societies, but also revealing the nature of the end of the world and the existence of heaven. So, when Suvin criticizes the mythical or religious approach, he is criticizing it specifically as it appears in Judeo-Christian cultures. What he considers to be timeless and fixed is the concept that all of human existence happens in between two unalterable points in linear time, Jesus's birth and his eventual resurrection. Suvin considers such an approach antithetical to science fiction because there is no real possibility for change so long as all events are contained in between those 2 points. Such a philosophy further bothers him as a Marxist, since Marxists are ideologically invested in seeing history as a different kind of linear progression, one that leads from the rise of capitalism to its downfall and eventually to the rise of socialism in its place. Thus, when Suvin claims that the religious or mythic approach is diametrically opposed to SF, he is relying upon a very particular understanding of religion, as well as specific historical and ideological approaches. Many Indigenous religions, on the other hand, emphasize the importance of space rather than time. And I do want to pause to note here that while Deloria's argument offers important insights into Native religions, I have to acknowledge that he also tends toward broad generalizations, which is partially just a reflection of when he was writing. And he sometimes collapses many different beliefs into a kind of pan-Indian religious description. So I'm relying on Deloria here to lay out a broad theoretical argument about Indigenous as opposed to Euro-American religions in general. But it's also very important to balance those broad characterizations with more tribally specific discussions of particular religious beliefs. So according to Deloria, I'm wondering if we can move this. Here we go. According to Deloria, In contrast to Christianity's focus on linear progression through time, the vast majority of Indian tribal religions have a sacred center at a particular place. That is, Indigenous religions tend to be spatially, not temporally oriented. As a result, within Indigenous communities, quote, it was not what people believed to be true that was important, but what they experienced as true. Or, as Deloria reiterates in a later text, experience is not limited by mental considerations and assumptions regarding the universe. In other words, because Euro-Americans understand the world as a temporal progression, an idea that is based in a religious belief, they make certain assumptions about how the world works and what is possible within it. On the other hand, because people raised in indigenous cultures are more likely to focus on what happens within a particular place, they do not share the set of assumptions or expectations that are grounded in the linear progression of time. Where a Western European worldview defines reality by, quote, what you allow your mind to accept, not what you experience, Indigenous worldviews allow people to more easily accept whatever events occur, no matter how unexpected or unlikely they may be. The benefits of such an approach are often seen in Indigenous science fiction, where the native characters are better able to accept the presence of and respond to the novum that initiates change in the world. So, for instance, Billy Badass sees the damage done by the radiation monster and immediately recognizes the presence of something unknown and other than human, while local police and even the FBI offer strained explanations about drug use and something they call a decline in family values. In light of Deloria's explanation, this response makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, their refusal to accept the existence of the monster makes it virtually impossible for local law enforcement to address the problem or prevent additional deaths. And in adherence to the familiar tropes of science fiction, as they ignore or deny its existence, the creature continues to grow stronger until it threatens the entire world. While the monster feeds on illegally disposed toxic waste and becomes quite literally a larger threat, Billy discusses the mysterious murders with his own allies. Mickey, a Mohawk medicine man and lapsed Irish Catholic priest, Jana, a Kazakh scientist studying the long-term effects of radiation exposure, and Sarah, a Jewish doctor treating genetic birth defects on the Paiute Reservation. Billy compares the murders to those committed by both Stoneman and Uktena, two monsters from traditional Cherokee stories. Because he learned these tales from his grandfather, he has a frame of reference that allows him to grasp the concept of a world-destroying monster, although he is unfamiliar with the specifics of this one in particular. Moreover, because he interprets the situation from an Indigenous perspective, Billy is prepared to accept what he experiences as true, even when that experience seems to defy all rational and objective standards, to use Deloria's phrasing. Thus, instead of wasting valuable time waiting to be convinced of the monster's existence, he can more swiftly move toward finding a solution to the problem. His friends, who either come from cultures with their own monster stories or who are simply willing to take Billy seriously, are likewise better prepared to help him find that solution. In many works of science fiction, the monster emerges as a heavy-handed metaphor for misunderstood humans. Sanders, however, subverts that convention as he insists that readers confront this radiation monster on its own terms, as a truly unknowable other. When we first meet the monster, the narrator tells us, there we go, that it possessed an awareness, rough and chaotic, but rapidly developing, of itself and its surroundings. But this awareness had no resemblance whatever to the consciousness of man, beast, plant, or computer. There are no words in any human or electronic language to describe what it used for thought processes. From this first introduction, the novel emphasizes the creature's difference and inherent strangeness. Finding language to describe it is a struggle, and the best that the narrator can do is explain what the creature is not. It cannot be compared to any living thing on our planet, and our languages inevitably fail to describe it because no metaphor can establish an accurate relationship. In fact, in the midst of trying to describe the creature, Sanders says that, quote, "None of these statements means anything." Although he tries to describe the creature through language, all language can ultimately do is, paradoxically, acknowledge its own failings. And even as we learn more about the creature, the narrator continues to alienate readers rather than helping them understand or make sense of the monster. He repeatedly highlights the failure of human communication and concepts, explaining that, nope, it had not come from anywhere, since it did not necessarily move through physical space, and in any case, its previous environment had not been, strictly speaking, a where, being without spatial location or coordinates. It was not, for that matter, an it. It possessed neither form nor mass. Its composition included nothing identifiable by the terms of this universe or subject to any known or unknown laws of physical science. Even the verb to be is inappropriate. By any rational and objective standard, it did not exist. Here, Sanders challenges readers to grapple with a concept that he cannot possibly explain and that we cannot possibly imagine. As Billy and Jana confront the monster, they also have to grapple with their sheer inability to make sense of it. It staunchly refuses the popular claim that science fiction is primarily about establishing metaphors for human experience. Suvin has argued that, whether in space or in time, the new framework is correlative to the new inhabitants. The aliens, utopians, monsters, or simply differing strangers are a mirror to man, just as the differing country is a mirror for his world. Though Suvin provides plenty of examples to support his claim, the theory clearly fails to encompass a book like The Ballad of Billy Badass, where not only metaphors, but all language fails to convey meaning. We might better understand the extreme otherness of this radiation monster by turning to theorist Michael Pinsky, who proposes a theoretical model of science fiction as an ethical encounter with the other. As Pinsky asks what it means to confront something that is truly unrecognizable, he argues that science fiction has the capacity to imagine a genuine encounter with alterity. For Pinsky, quote, "The real issue is the relationship between the two poles of technological disposition, the actuality of an other and the absolute external truth of the other, and how this very relationship is articulated through the space of science fiction." He further argues that the space of science fiction foregrounds a discussion of ethics, claiming that we exist already in the world, and any understanding of ourselves must go hand in hand with an understanding of ethics and our relationship to others. In Pinsky's conception, science fiction offers readers the opportunity to imagine the existence of something outside of ourselves, and, even more importantly, to consider how we will behave in response to such beings. Pinsky's definition can help readers make sense of Indigenous science fiction in particular, because it challenges us to acknowledge that alterity does in fact exist, that the entire world cannot be reduced to a metaphorical representation of the self. Suvin's understanding of science fiction as metaphor can help readers bridge gaps between the human and the alien, but Pinsky's approach cautions us against extending that metaphor too far. It is important to recognize similarities, to see an unfamiliar other as a human being with dignity. But if we reduce the other to a mirror image of the self, we may accidentally assimilate and thus do ethical violence to that other. In the same way, significant differences exist between people from various cultures, regions, or tribal nations, and universalizing one's own perspective may lead to the marginalization of other voices. By confronting the presence of the other and asking readers to consider the ethics of that encounter, Pinsky challenges readers to reflect on our responses to alterity. When faced with real difference, are we able to accept other perspectives, or do we insist on reproducing dominant narratives and enforcing those narratives upon the other? Because science fiction values change and asks us to question normative assumptions, it also encourages us to consider how we engage with difference in our own lives. Sanders' monster is practically the Platonic ideal of the alien other as described by Pinsky. It completely resists any attempt to assimilate the other into the self because, as Sanders establishes from the outset, there is no way to bridge the gap between this creature and anything in our own world. And yet, this otherness is also a point of unresolved tension within the novel. In a book about the ethical treatment of the other, why create an alien other that must literally be destroyed in order to save humanity? This unbridgeable otherness is particularly unusual within a Cherokee context because, as Brian Burkhart suggests, traditional Cherokee monsters, like monsters in many other Indigenous traditions, still exist in relation to kinship. Describing a story in which the Cherokee trickster Jistu defeats a monster, Burkhart notes that Jistu first tricks the monster by dressing up as his auntie and paying him a visit. Even the monster is obliged to welcome this auntie, to provide her with a meal and a place to sleep. Burkhart points out that a similar relationship exists in other Indigenous literary traditions, as among the Navajo, where both enemy way and blessing way offer structures for maintaining relationships. As Burkhart puts it, you can't be out of kinship. Even walking away or shunning, it's a form of kinship. The fact that Sanders' radiation monster is not metaphorically human, that it does exist outside of kinship relations, indicates how radically un-Indigenous it really is. Here, we might draw similarities to accounts of early warfare between European and Indigenous groups, where Native peoples were shocked to realize that the European method of warfare culminated in total annihilation rather than maintaining a balance between traditional enemies. Similarly, a monster that exists outside of kinship responsibilities, a monster that threatens to destroy the entire world, is foreign to traditional Cherokee understandings. Perhaps the monster resists being brought into relationship precisely because its existence in our universe is predicated on Euro-American behaviors and decisions. It has been summoned by New Agers who carelessly appropriate Indigenous ceremonies, and it feeds on stores of nuclear waste that have been haphazardly disposed of in the deserts outside of Las Vegas. Just as Euro-Americans historically refused or abused kinship relations with their native neighbors, so does the monster continue to resist engaging through either metaphor or ethical encounter. Having acknowledged the existence of this paradoxical creature, then, Billy and his friends must next figure out how to combat a creature that does not even technically exist in our dimension, but which is nonetheless capable of mass destruction. Billy, who learned Cherokee ceremonies from his grandfather, turns to those traditions in search of protection. The first form of resistance to have an effect on the monster is a Cherokee tobacco ceremony, which Billy completes according to his grandfather's instructions. It is important to note that in Grandfather Ninekiller's ritual, there is room for adaptation. Since Billy does not have access to any actual Cherokee tobacco while in Nevada, he borrows some from Mickey. He explains that, quote, actually, in Cherokee medicine, the tobacco itself was not of absolute importance. In a pinch, even cigarette tobacco could be remade for ritual purposes with the proper ikaweski. Still, it was better to do things right. So, although Mickey is Mohawk rather than Cherokee, and although he has served as a Catholic priest as well as a medicine man, his tobacco will still work in Billy's ceremony. In fact, this tobacco is considered closer to doing things right than cigarette tobacco, suggesting that sacred objects from other traditions have power and should be honored across cultures. Here, the novel emphasizes again the importance of following tribally specific practices, but it also suggests the benefits of building alliances across communities. Billy is grounded in a tradition of his own, unlike someone like Magda, but he is also able to incorporate other traditions when necessary, as long as he does so thoughtfully and respectfully. Through the example of the tobacco ceremony, the novel demonstrates that both tribally specific traditions and pan-tribal alliances are necessary for human survival. After he has prepared the tobacco according to his grandfather's instructions, Billy goes camping in the desert, where he and Jana plan to catch their first real glimpse of the monster. Before they settle down for the night, Billy places the tobacco in a pipe, lights it, and makes 4 circles around their campground, blowing smoke in each of the 4 directions as he goes. Sanders explains these actions precisely, noting that Billy, quote, did not offer the pipe to the 4 directions in the way of the Plains tribes, and that he also did not sing or make any sound at all because the Igoesti was already contained in the tobacco, stored and now released by the act of smoking. Although Sanders explains in the author's note that he will not describe a real tobacco ceremony because it would be sacrilegious to do so, he nonetheless gives readers a sense of the precise structure and logic of the ritual and its grounding in a Cherokee worldview. By devoting several paragraphs to this description, the novel emphasizes the weight of such a ceremony, and a few pages later, that serious attitude is justified when the tobacco protects Billy and Jana. It sort of creates almost a force field that the monster can't get through. At first, Cherokee tradition alone is enough to stop the creature. But as it grows, Billy and his companions must draw on stronger forces, and the radiation monster is ultimately destroyed by an unlikely source: the power of all the children around the world who have been mutated by exposure to radiation. This is a big and complex scene that I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about here, but again, I'm happy to talk more about it. Though the novel does not give a detailed explanation of how the children are able to defeat the monster, they seem to have harnessed the power imparted by the radiation that has so affected their bodies. Just as the monster itself is the physical embodiment of radiation exposure, so are the children the physical embodiment of the harm caused by that exposure. These children, who might typically be seen merely as victims because of their disabilities, actually have immense power. They are able to confront and destroy the monster that represents the damage inflicted upon them locally and individually, as well as the danger that nuclear power poses to the global community. This resolution also reflects traditional values like those seen in the Cherokee creation story, where the smallest beings are able to affect the greatest change. In this tale, various animals dive to the bottom of the ocean in search of land. In some versions, such as in Cherokee artist Joseph Erb's short film, The Beginning They Told, the creature who finally succeeds is the tiny water beetle, who is therefore responsible for building the earth itself. And Erb's film is only about 11 minutes long. It's available on YouTube, and it was, I think, the first animated film entirely in the Cherokee language. It's pretty cool. So highly recommend it. In the same way that the water beetle builds the earth, the children are able to save the world by solving a seemingly impossible problem. In order to achieve their goal, they must recognize their similarities and agree to work together. Just as Billy, Jana, Mickey, and Sarah form cross-cultural alliances, so are these children able to draw strength from one another, as well as from a variety of culturally specific traditions and ceremonies. Ultimately, the Ballad of Billy Badass and the Rose of Turkestan uses the science fictional trope of the radiation monster as an entry point to discuss questions of alienation, ethical encounters, and cross-cultural alliances. Sanders' monster is a truly inaccessible and even unimaginable alien, but it is not evil. The fact that it nearly destroys our planet serves only to remind readers that blame should be placed on the humans who have created, tested, and manipulated nuclear power for political and economic gain. Although our actions have not yet spawned a radiation monster in the real world, the damage that has been done is just as pervasive, extending far beyond arbitrary racial or political boundaries. Sanders suggests that the only way to prevent or resolve this threat is to treat radiation itself and the continued human processes that produce it as the enemy. We must acknowledge the demands of the other and form alliances across cultural and national borders rather than appropriating the rituals of other cultures or acting out of self-interest alone. By acting for the good of the community instead of the individual, that is, by following an Indigenous model of ethics, it becomes possible to combat the monstrous effects of imperialism and finally to save the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was so interesting and wide-ranging. If any participants have questions, you can post them in the Q&A and I'll read them and Miriam can answer them. But meanwhile, I was thinking about a lot of things as you were talking, and among them were some of the earlier novels that were published in this current flourishing of Native American literature. And Scott Momaday's Housemaid of Dawn, yeah, and Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony, which are not science fiction, but bring up several of the ideas that you've raised, which include the absolute importance of context and the ability or the permissibility of changing traditions when context changes, and also the importance of being able to recognize where the site of true evil is and what one's ethical response to that is. So I'm wondering if in the novels that you talk about, is there a qualitative difference between the science fiction components and the more traditional novels we might call literary fiction, or is there some other kind of is it only limited to the presence in the novel you're discussing, for example, of this monster that presumably does not actually exist in the real world, even though it seems also not to technically exist in the novel either?
I love that you brought up Ceremony, which I teach every year. And yeah, I think that there are certain ways that I think for my students, for instance, it would be easier to read a novel that puts the evil on a radiation monster than it is for them to understand what's happening in Ceremony. So I think if you're asking about qualitative difference, I guess I'm not totally sure if I'm following that part of it. Can you tell me a little bit more?
Okay, so I don't read a lot of science fiction, and I'm trying to overcome that prejudice. I think there are kinds of action and kinds of characters that can appear in science fiction and that often do appear in science fiction, like this radiation monster, that cannot appear or be at least received patiently in literary fiction. Right?
Right.
And so is there something that science fiction permits us to do, to think about ethically, that other fiction doesn't? Because in Ceremony, for instance, Teo has to realize that he cannot participate in this kind of violence he's tempted to, right? And so it is this ethical understanding of evil and the enemy that is more realistic, we might say, in some ways than in science fiction.
Yeah, I think science fiction opens up a space because I think it works nicely, well, in a couple of ways. I think, first of all, for non-native audiences, or just folks who are, anyone who's not particularly familiar with native worldviews and storytelling traditions, if you're going into a science fiction novel, you're already a little bit more open-minded to things that you think might not exist in the real world. And so I think it actually does this nice work where, and I am thinking about teaching Indigenous science fiction in particular, students are more open and receptive to both what they would, to both the science fictional aspect, like the radiation monster, and let's say the Cherokee tobacco ceremony, which they might initially be inclined to disregard and to write off as something that was also fictional and not real. And so on the one hand, I think it's great because readers of science fiction expect to encounter the unknown, and so they're ready to do so. I think on the other hand, what gets to be a challenge very quickly is to make sure that readers don't put those two things in the same category, right? That readers understand that the witchery in ceremony is not to be dismissed as fictional in the same way that a radiation monster is. And that's actually one of the things that I was most curious about when I started working on this project, was what happens when you have these Indigenous worldviews and sort of religious beliefs that come into contact with something that is more purely science fictional. And I think that's one of the things I find most interesting, is the ways that often it's not just in Billy Badass that it's some kind of Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous belief that is able to counteract a lot of the problems that are born out of Euro-American culture and science and capitalism and all of the things that go along with that. So I think in that way, it does create this new and imaginative space that might not exist in other genres of fiction. And I think it also means that it can just be more playful, and that there's a kind of, I mean, you can tell from the title Billy Badass, right? And from some of the descriptions of things happening in that novel, that I think while it's addressing very serious themes, it's also coming in under the guise of something silly and ridiculous, and it gives readers permission to laugh. And so it is, I think, also can maybe reach a wider audience in that way, of folks who might not want to sit down and tackle ceremony, for instance.
Okay. Well, that's a very good segue into one of the questions here from Kel Sassy, which is asking you if you could talk a little bit about the illustration on the cover of your book.
Isn't it amazing?
Sometimes authors have very little control over that, and sometimes they have more, but it is a pick me up and look at me kind of cover.
That is a piece of artwork by the Cherokee artist Roy Boney. I did find it and beg the publisher to let me use it, and they talked to him and got permission. It is, I think it's called Sequoiazilla, which I find really delightful, because I think it does capture so beautifully what science fiction does, right? That it is unexpected, it's a little bit silly, it's asking you to look at something familiar in a new way.
Yeah, good. Okay, another question. Kel then adds, looks like a possibly Matisse monster. Yeah. So then we have a question from Amy Gore. Does Indigenous science fiction extend kinship to artificial intelligence and or to technology?
Yes. Oh, that's such a great question. Yes, I think it absolutely does. I think a really good example of that, there are different writers playing with this in different ways, but one of my favorites is the Cherokee novelist Blake Hausman. His novel is called Riding the Trail of Tears, and I do talk about it in the book, but very briefly, the premise is that a company has created a virtual reality experience where tourists get strapped into virtual reality suits and spend 3 hours experiencing the Trail of Tears as Cherokee people. And they are led by paid tour guides. So the narrator of the novel is a young Cherokee woman named Tallulah, who has a history degree and has essentially found herself being paid to be the poster child of this company. And the original intent is that it would be an educational experience, but it quickly becomes all about keeping the customers happy and making sure that they tip and making sure that they return. And so many of the uglier aspects of the history of removal are sort of glossed over in the ride. And so that's kind of the situation at the beginning of the book. But what happens is that the Cherokee Little People, who are sort of kind of trickster creatures in traditional Cherokee stories, enter into the game and start messing with it and changing what's happening. So they sort of rally the digital Cherokee, who are just supposed to be non-gamer characters, and convince them to resist their programming to go to Oklahoma and to turn around and attack the soldiers and go back to North Carolina to hide out in the mountains. And I think that book is, that was a long way of getting to this, but that book is absolutely encouraging us to recognize those Cherokee characters as not as non-human people, in the same way that animals might be recognized as non-human people. And that instead of thinking of them as programs that disappear when the game gets turned off, we need to think about them as having this recurrent experience of trauma, of riding and being killed on the Trail of Tears over and over again. And it's revealed that they have a memory of having been forced to go through that experience over and over again. So I think there's that. I think Daniel Wilson is also a Cherokee writer who wrote Robopocalypse. And I think he's also experimenting with those ideas, although it might be a little less clear cut. We might not be quite as sympathetic in Daniel Wilson's world we certainly are supposed to recognize that the robots are sentient, but I'm not sure that we're supposed to side with the robots.
Oh. Okay. June Scuttler has put a link in the Q&A, Louis Arista Petuous Kite release from MIT Press. I'm not sure if you are familiar with that. June, if you want to post that in the chat, I think everyone would be able to then have access to it.
That would be great. Thank you, June.
Yeah. I was wondering, in terms of the primary text you chose to discuss in the book, whether you actively chose to feature more Cherokee writers given your location, or whether that was those were just the books that happened to really coincide with the issues you wanted to explore.
It was an accident at the beginning, and the more time I spent with it, the more I realized that I'm very lucky to have access to so many Cherokee texts, given my location. But I was working on this while living in Ohio and California as well. There just seems to be quite a lot of Cherokee science fiction. But there have also, some of it is that these were among the earlier texts that came out, and some more recent science fiction, like Marrow Thieves or Future Home of the Living God, came out while the project was already underway. And so those are things that I would love to circle around to at a later date too.
Okay. Well, I see the chat here is not enabled right now. Although I think our audio, yeah. So
should I stop screen sharing? Would that make it?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
But if we look at Louis Arista Petuous Kite from MIT Press, we should be able to find the book that June was referring to. Okay. So what are you working on next?
I would like to, I would say in the early stages of working on something that brings Indigenous women back into the conversation. This project started out actually with 2 more chapters that got cut, but every single novel I found in those early stages was by a man, and I do have a background in gender studies as well, and I was really quite concerned about that. And so part of that again is that novels by Cherie Demeline and Louise Erdrich have come out since I started work on the project, and I want to revisit those now that they are out in the world. Work by Darcy Little Badger, but also just kind of taking a broader look at formal and generic experimentation. To look at work like Skawanati's Machinima. There are several authors, female authors, who have published, who have self-published stories and novels that might fall into this genre. So I want to look more closely at what Indigenous women writers are doing with genre fiction and sort of how they're responding to, I think, what can be, they could easily be marginalized in 2 different directions because genre fiction is still so widely, I think, associated with men rather than women.
Yeah, I think, and certainly traditionally, I think even with readers, that would have been true until maybe the last generation.
Yeah.
So, and then Kel Sassy asks, do you consider Darcy Little Badger's A Snake Fell to Earth to be science fiction?
I'm not sure yet. I just finished reading it recently, and I'm still kind of processing it. And I think one thing I'm learning is that I'm going to have to reconsider my definitions again, because I got really committed to this definition of science fiction as opposed to fantasy. And then I started listening to people like China Mieville and reconsidering how useful those definitions are now. Maybe they were more useful in the past, but to think about, Mieville argues that the distinction has been used basically to make science fiction look superior to fantasy. And so I'd like to think more carefully about Little Badger and about other authors whose work might not fit as neatly in this box. And yeah, I think exploring terminology is one of the big projects I have in front of me.
Yes, yeah. And I think that is true, not just with these 2 categories or with Indigenous writing, but I think we're in a literary moment when almost every generic boundary is being challenged. And there's a lot of crossover work. There's a lot of what we call hybrid work. And that's where I think much of the most interesting work is being done today. So
I agree.
Okay. Well, we are past 2 o'clock. This has been a really interesting conversation. I have some books now that are going to get onto my to be read stack. So I'm thankful for that. And thank you everyone who participated, and thank you, Miriam. And again, the recording of this talk will be posted on YouTube toward the end of next week.
Thank you so much for inviting me.